Good morning. Um, Let me go ahead and pray first, and then we'll get into the title and the whole piece with this chapter. Dear Lord, thank you for waking us up this morning. Thank you for another opportunity to get into Black psychological perspectives. Please be with us now as we discuss and hopefully learn some new things. Thank you for your continued blessings. Amen. All right. So it is early in the morning here at Oakwood University. I usually try to record in the morning, but sometimes it happens differently. Either way, going through a lot. I'll say this. This topic is closely related to the beginning of my career, mainly as a school psychologist and my start in graduate school. In 1996, and definitely 95, but by the 96 part of that first school year I had in graduate school, after leaving Oakwood University, going to San Diego State, there was a broader discussion, particularly in Congress, by one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Williams, from the St. Louis area at Washington University, who testified before Congress about a term he had developed and how teachers in Oakland were being taught about Ebonics, but not necessarily taught Ebonics, right? And they were being taught that so they can better teach standard American English to a range of students who were going to school in Oakland and also in Los Angeles. There was no real big scrutiny on Los Angeles because they had done it pretty successfully along with their English learner program. But in Oakland, for whatever reason, there was much more scrutiny. And so these folks were testifying before Congress. As a student at the time, a graduate student who was on what was called an African-centered school psychology project. So, and it was a federally funded personnel preparation grant by the Congress at that time, which was under Bill Clinton, right? And very interesting times. I don't think there will ever be another African-centered grant of any kind coming from the United States government, but at that time there it was, and I was involved with this. We were writing and presenting about it, and so we had some displays at San Diego State in our lobby in one of those glass cases, talking about our work with not just Ebonics, but other issues in psychology, as well as our other colleagues who are working on bilingual issues, particularly bilingual Spanish issues, bilingual Asian language issues in public schools. And so you have this kind of multicultural display that was defaced by local neo-Nazis in the San Diego area. For those that aren't familiar, one of the neo-Nazi movements started in the San Diego area in Fallbrook, right next door to Oceanside, where I grew up, where my hometown is. And so I found myself in two different spaces. One, I was defending even the idea of Ebonics, that there is a particular way Black people speak, whether some call it African American Vernacular English, right, AAVE, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, or they call it Ebonics, and I'm paraphrasing Dr. Robert Williams, ebony and phonics, just going together into the term Ebonics. Even comedians like Eddie Griffin really went off on the idea of Ebonics, yet he uses it all in his comedy, which was somewhat frustrating. And in our discussions in class, we went through some of the same things. So I had been kind of avoiding this conversation, but it brings out certain things in people. For me, I've always been able to kind of deal with words in different ways, but when people denigrate where they come from, particularly Black people denigrate other Black people, and often they know and use Ebonics on a regular basis, yet they want to denigrate people for using it, I have a hard time with that. I'm just being real. I'm speaking of my own issues. So that being said, let's get into this chapter. All right. The chapter is called Cognition, Learning, and Language. So on chapter 9 of Belgrave and Allison's African American Psychology. And I think for many people who talk about liberation and revolution, language is a consistent part of that. And I'll just mention Dr. Frantz Fanon at that moment, if I can. Definite revolutionary, wrote several books, but he was a psychiatrist and freedom fighter. So I'm also going to quote an educational psychologist, someone who I followed in my career quite a bit, reading a lot of his work, got a chance to hear him speak a few times. His name is Dr. Asa Hilliard, and he has since passed. But one of the things he said is, I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them. As a kid growing up, and usually one of two black kids in my class, sometimes I wonder if there was any genius potential within me, and sometimes I wondered if people could see it within my friends, because I know I saw it. Shout out to my homie Scott Walker, Steve Woods, Greg Woods, genius dudes from Oceanside, California. All right, so the vocabulary that we're going to get into, we have quite a few here, but ones that I think you should be aware of. If not, you take the time to look up and get to know, because as we talk about these different ideas, we'll get back into them. Cognition, right? Having to do with how we think, how the brain operates with our thinking. Deficits, right? And we've talked about that one before. I just mentioned Ebonics, right? Dialect, SAE, or Standard American English. Another term is vernacular. Right. Knowledge acquisition, which is a large part of our cognitive development. Sensory, right? And we often associate that with either sensory input or our five senses, right? Stimuli, which may activate our senses, right? Relational and analytical, and we'll discuss both of those ideas, and we've talked about them before. Next, dependence versus independence in learning. Again, dependence versus independence in learning. Zero copula, and we'll talk about that some more, especially when it comes to language. Competence, and finally, oral tradition. Okay. So we'll get into this talking about some of the learning styles and a cultural orientation and some different viewpoints. And we have kind of two pieces here. If we talk about a relational learning style, it's focused on being field-centered or field self-centeredness, right? You have a greater interest in people, right? And you're interested as you look out on the field and within the field, right? It's not necessarily objective and looking back, but I'm connected with that person, greater interest in people. The field dependence, right, has you attending to the whole and integrating all stimulus material. And then there's spontaneity, having to do with an immediate response and interaction, right? I went to a comedy show this weekend, and I mentioned comedy because there are certain spaces where Black folk have been able to convey broader ideas, or at least some of these ideas in particular. And it was a Christian comedy event, so it was actually held at a church that's largely run by a white pastor, but yet who has a Black worship style. So it was an opportunity for the comedian to kind of look at these different and compare and contrast these two different worship styles, right? So analytical, right? And I divided kind of the slide here that I have on relational and analytical. I went through these three different areas with relational. I'm going to go through these other three different areas with analytical. Analytical has a stimulus centered, right? It focuses on the stimulus object, right? So as I may be at a sporting event as well, right? Well, let me go back to my church analogy. So he talked about a song, right? And the song was more the focus than the singer. Whereas in the relational, with the field self-centeredness, the singer's interaction with other people was important, right? The field independence, it was rule based, right? Categories for individual problem solving. And so I went to another worship service not too long ago, and it was with a group of educators. And they had a sheet that gave us a prayer to say. And I've only been to a few black churches where you have like a liturgy or a list of things that you would say, and so that would get you to think on your own, but still very rule based, right? And then this reflectivity, right? You spending time in reflection rather than going back to the relational and more immediate response. Okay, I'll continue some of these learning styles. I'll go back to relational here, right? Using group work to solve a problem, whereas analytical, you may work independently. Relational, you focus on every aspect of the situation, whereas analytical, you focus on a major issue or problem. Right. Relational, you may provide immediate responses, whereas analytical, you take time to reflect and systematically approach a problem. Right. Relational, you may discuss events that directly affect students, and analytical, you discuss events devoid of students' personal experiences. So let me try to bring some of these back here. I mentioned some of these ideas, right? So you got the comedy show, and you're talking about black church versus white church. Black church may tend to be more relational, right? And there's some call and response, and it's all right to tell the pastor to keep preaching, or tell the pastor to make it plain, or tell it like it is. Whereas usually in a white church, and I grew up going to a white church, you didn't clap. You didn't say anything out loud. You might say amen, but that's only after a long pause of a good song. But there was none of this back and forth kind of interaction. There's no immediate response. What's funny now is I go to my parents' church, and my father, after years of not saying anything, and witnessing my grandfather, who was very relational and very kind of African in his orientation, my father now will say amen spontaneously, or he'll look for a call and response, whereas he'll say very loud, God is good, and everyone else would say all the time, right? But when I grew up, that's not how that church was. But now when I go there, it is becoming more relational and analytical. It's not that people are isolated in these lockstep ways that if you're black, you have to be one way, if you're white, you have to be another way. But traditionally, this is kind of how it's played out, and people are becoming much more open. So yeah. Right. So the chapter also talks about kind of some older concepts, and I mean older, in the 90s, 80s. These were hot topics, but they were documented, I think, first during this time. And I even downloaded a piece here on Carrie Secret, who was and is a teacher who worked in Oakland, and she used a lot of this to incorporate in her teaching related to teaching students in Oakland, and she was teaching them calculus, right? She was also not correcting them when they spoke Ebonics, because she's like, most of what I'm teaching them is math, but at the same time, I'm going to show them multiple ways to say things so they know how to code switch in between. Right. So let me go back to verb, rhythm, and movement, and that's really what we're talking about. Verve, V-E-R-V-E, rhythm and movement in learning. So Boykin, research on the East Coast, spoke about verb in the 80s, and it's an improvisational style that expresses rhythmic and creative and arises out of the contextual environment, a preference for stimulus change, higher energy level, and a faster pace, right? And rhythm is a regular repetition of weak and strong elements, often silence and sound in speech, music, art, and everyday life, a recurring pattern that gives energy and meaning to life. Allen and Butler, right? in 96, they looked at African American student performance, and they saw that African American student performance was slightly higher on high movement expression than low movement expression. So designed to move either around the classroom or to have some, change in stimuli more frequently. Miss Carrie Secret, as I mentioned before, she taught this way, and we're using most of these methods to do that. I had a chance to see her, Asa Hilliard, Wade Nobles, and her in San Francisco in the Bay Area when I was a graduate student. And she brought her students, had them, doing calculus problems, but she also had them do it was somewhat of a dance. I mean, some folks might call it praise dancing or whatever, but she had the students, have a motivational and inspirational song, and they all danced to the song along with being able to cite all these algebraic equations. And it was a more of a holistic approach to teaching students rather than just, well, we just learned math, we just learned reading, we just learned writing. We put them all together in a show, really, that expresses all these different facets of who we are as young people. Amazing teacher. Dr. Asa Hilliard wrote about her several times, but in a book chapter called Young, Gifted, and Black by Perry, Steele, and Hilliard. So I think it's a 2003 book. All right. Communal learning style research is what we'll talk about next. And African American students learn well with harmony, cooperation, affect, and a sense of community, right? So, and I had to learn the difference when I was in graduate school between effect and affect. And affect has to do with something that I tried to kind of hold in, and that's my emotional content, right? If I can quote one of my favorite movies there from Bruce Lee, right? But we have to add this emotional content, right? And Bruce Lee as he's teaching a young student, right? Excuse me there, just had a Bruce Lee moment. Highly stratified and competitive environments African Americans do not learn well in, right? And thus, what's interesting is the American educational system is often a highly stratified and competitive environment, particularly as you're trying to get into, advanced placement courses that could lead to placements at highly competitive colleges and then highly competitive degrees. So you're either able to have the job or the professorate, that type of thing. And a lot of it is antithetical to how Black folk work and learn. So Albury in 98 saw that white students learned and preferred individual settings, and Black students preferred communal settings. All right. With some of the features of Black English or African Vernacular English or Ebonics, Carrie Secret was asked, do you ever allow students to use Ebonics in your classroom? And this was a reporter who interviewed her. And Ms. Secret replied, the word that bothers me is allow. Students talk. They bring their home language to school. That is their right. So this approach was very controversial, right? Rather than checking language constantly, she's either adding to or allowing students to expand that language. But allowing them, she's like, nah, they are. And they just be, if I could use Ebonics. So some of the concepts that go with Ebonics are zero copula, right? This idea that I'm just starting a sentence and here it goes. I'm not breaking it down or need to have a the at the beginning of the sentence, right? Been, this concept of time. And if I were to say, I done been told you, right? I done been talking about Ebonics since 96, before you were born. So if you want to come up here and try to talk about it, it's not going to work, at least in this area, because I done been here, right? And that use of been, I think, is an important conception of time that expresses a very different view of time that African people have Definitely from the West African area, but I've seen and heard in many parts of the world. Turning a word into its opposite meaning, like Run DMC and Peter Piper lyrics, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good, or Michael Jackson talking about, he's bad. Anyways, yeah, dated reference there, but I'm an old dude. So, repeating of pronouns. Another one is no S necessary to show possession, especially if you're already using that in a sentence. And I wish I had some more things coming off the top of my head, but right now it's early in the morning, and I want to make sure that I keep this short. Lack of subject-verb agreement. Rather than what does this mean, you may say in Ebonics, what do this mean, right? Multiple negation, ain't got no money versus I don't have any money, right? In zero past tense, no use of an ed to express past tense. Her dress was stained would be changed to her dress was stained. All right. Some of these pieces I see very regionally, right? But they definitely happen. I run into people who, they're very proud of the fact that they may speak a certain type of Creole, Pidgin English, or Patois, right? Well, African Americans have their own type of dialect as well. That's developed out of retentions, and this is where Ebonics differs from African American vernacular English. A lot of people assume that African American vernacular English just kind of comes up. And this is the linguists who write about it, and this is what I've read from linguists. They focused more on, well, here it is, and we're just looking at the phenomena. Whereas the Ebonics researchers say, no, it's definitely related to parts of African language structures, and we just kind of reworked English to be able to express African concepts with African language structures. Very different conversation when it comes to either linguists or other people who study language. All right. So when it comes to the meaning of speech to African Americans through Ogbu and perceptions of African American English, right? Ogbu was, again, he was not an American. He was a Nigerian looking at American life and writing about it in the Bay Area, which is kind of a deconstructed place because a lot of the black people who live in the Bay Area had not been there for long, and in that, maybe 30 to 50 years because they had migrated from the South. But as he was looking at these things, he saw two dialects, and many people would know those two dialects, right? African American vernacular English and standard American English. And it would maybe preferred for two different settings, and students switch between slang and what he would call proper English. And the children learned slang or Ebonics at home, and they would switch it up at school versus the playground. We already know, we've looked at some of this before, but I refer to Dr. Toya Wyatt's research where she found that black students as young as 3 years old were aware of the difference in Ebonics and standard American English, and they would correct each other's language. So parents and children recognize that slang might cause a problem at school as well. And so they would talk to their kids about code switching, right? Switching between one language or another for one setting or another, for one objective or end for another. So African American English has had a stigma on TV and court, and well as different places as work, even in people's names, if you heard about some of these resume studies that have gone on, right? African American vernacular English goes well beyond just this idea that black people didn't know what else to say. It's been used to express certain concepts. Langston Hughes' poem, with Mother to Son, there is a great reading by Viola Davis, but I'll give it my best shot. But it says, well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor. Bare. But all the time, I see been a climbing on, and reaching lands and turning corners, sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on those steps, because you find it's kind of harder. Don't you fall now, because I see it's still going, honey. I was still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. That's from Langston Hughes, Mother to Son, from his collected poems, from the estate of Langston Hughes there. But there's a use of a word that I haven't heard a lot, but I used to hear quite a bit, particularly from my grandparents, aunts, and uncles. And it's spelled here in Langston Hughes' poem, I''se, eyes, eyes. I relate it similarly to the Jamaican I and I, but this concept of kind of seeing myself as soul, mind, and body, right? And she's talking about her life as well, and life going beyond, and this idea that Hughes is layering in about stairs, right, and climbing up, right? Deep metaphors and other things that are there, but this conception of myself is more than just one, but as something deeper than that. And that's expressed with Ebonics. It's not expressed with standard American English, but most of American society is not into this idea. It's, again, we talked about earlier, it's more individualized. This is more relational. All right. So relational, I'm even relating to parts of myself. All right. So the book also offered some strategies for working with African American children and suggested that affective or emotional support, right, and small group learning, peer tutoring, family type groups is important. A task combined with the responsibility of part of the larger group, right? Opportunities to explore community, encourage them to use their knowledge to help the community. Right? One of the things that I used to do as a advisor, particularly for high school or the Black Student Union at where I worked before at Cal State Long Beach, I would tell students, when you go home for Thanksgiving, you need to have a story or a narrative about what you're going to do to help the community, or you need to actually do something to help people. You need to use this new knowledge that you're gaining and take it back, right? And this is also, studies have also shown that students' greater awareness, particularly Black students' awareness of their identity and then application of that identity, leads to better academic outcomes, right? So if we want to enhance self-concept and in creative expression, we find these opportunities in academic tasks, right? As I was speaking before about Carrie Secret doing that as well and being more holistic in that approach. Also expose students to African American culture, tradition, symbols, proverbs, orality, performance, art. And when you do that, you let them know that what they bring is not less than, but it's a part of this whole conversation of being human in the world. You should have many opportunities to talk, express, and hear music while they are at work. Stevie Wonder, in one of his songs, says, "Love is life in flight." Well, music may be the vehicle that gets us up there. All right. This last piece, shared power and relationship with parents, students, teachers, and administrators, rather than kind of this top-down thing. It's good to reach out and connect on that level. With college students, there's cultural factors that impact African American college students, and for good or for bad, but they're interested in teacher immediacy and showing increased sensory stimulation, attentiveness, liking, psychological closeness, and active engagement and interaction seems to work better long term for African American college students. So this may look like, smiling, eye contact with students, movement around the classroom, addressing students by name, using humor, and talking to students before and after class. I do this stuff, I don't know, because I like what I'm doing, right? But I also do it because I know it helps engage students. The topics that I discuss are hard sometimes, or they're new. They're so new, right? Particularly teaching Black psychology itself. It's so new that because students haven't had any other venue in which to talk about it, they need a sense of community in order to do so. So at our classroom at Oakwood, particularly on days where we have discussions, we arrange our chairs in a particular semicircle so we can all see each other's face, and we get into it. Nobody gets left behind in the discussion. Everybody has an opportunity to be involved. But we'll start the class with jokes, and sometimes we'll end with jokes. But we're definitely a part of a communal experience. We also here at Oakwood, we do worship, and the students participate in that activity as well. All right. So some of the questions that we've had in our discussion: how is African American English or Black dialect used in your current life? Can African American English express things that are not as readily expressed in other parts of life? If yes, then how so? And we've talked about some of that, but you may have some other examples. In a course where you learned the most, what style was used? Was it communal, relational, field dependent, field independent, analytical? My sense is that a lot of courses, particularly courses for African Americans or African American students, incorporate both of these things. Can African Americans use both African and more Western European ways of learning to solve problems? And then if so, to what end? I think the answer is yes, but I think the interesting answer is, to what end would we use both of these conceptual ways of learning to solve problems? All right, there's so much more to be said about Ebonics and learning and cognition, but this is kind of a entryway into some of that discussion. And it's pieces of the conversation I haven't heard for a while, because I think many folks have a hard time with the idea of Ebonics, right? And it really is a remnant of who we were, right, in Africa, and it reminds us that I have to speak in English, and I'm a stolen person. Therefore, I have to use what I can in this weak language that doesn't express all the totality of who I am, and I have to kind of force it to make it my own. And that forcing, I think, is what bothers people. And then if you're not trying to, learn both standard American English and African vernacular English or Ebonics, and if you're not able to do both, it does leave you at a disadvantage. I will say this last thing: being bilingual or bidialectical opens synapses within your brain that allows you to think and bring in new and important and exciting information, right? And I talk with my students in the class about our brains, and particularly our working memory, being able to hold so many bits of information. Code switching kind of expands that, rather than the basic 5 bits that most people walk around with. And I kind of think of it, I got 5 fingers, but if I want to take it that next step, I may have 7 bits of information that I can walk around with. But if I really want to push it, I might have 10, right? And that may be related to emotional content, but it may also be related to being able to, add some extra stimulus, whether it's my hip hop hands, right? Or whatever kind of expression that I need within my body in order to hold and contain everything that I need to get across to you. That's, to me, is part of being an African within America. I hope this made sense to me. This is stuff that's near and dear to my heart. I've been studying it for a long time, a couple decades now. And I want to give a shout out to Geneva Smitherman, Orlando Patterson, and again, Dr. Robert Williams, all these folks who I've learned from, who've taught me about a lot of these issues. Also, Dr. Toya Wyatt, and one of my mentors who passed, Dr. Sharon Grant Henry. All right, hope this works for you, and look forward to sharing some more. We only have a few more of these left. Hope all is well with you, and have a great day.